He stood in that boardroom and got laughed at, cut off mid-sentence, dismissed with a smirk, his idea tossed aside like garbage. Not because it lacked merit, not because it didn't work, but because of who said it. Because when you're a black man in a white-powered room, they don't hear your voice, they see your skin. And that's all it takes. No one flinched. No one questioned it. They just watched as the team lead leaned back in his chair, grinning, proud of the way he put the so-called junior in his place. That moment didn't just expose the hierarchy. It exposed something uglier, something deeper. This company was polished on the surface, but rotting underneath. And what they did that day was more than ignorance. It was a system doing exactly what it was built to do. What they didn't see, what they couldn't imagine, was what he was already building in silence. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a reckoning, one they never saw coming. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what you think is really happening here. Like and subscribe, because what happens next will flip everything upside down. Elijah Monroe entered the sleek, glass-paneled lobby of Sterling & Company with a calm demeanor that didn't turn heads, and that suited him just fine. The building was a cathedral to corporate ego, steel sculptures, neon-lit mission statements mounted on stone walls, and receptionists who smiled like they were guarding the gates of something holy. Elijah checked in, clipped on his visitor badge for the last time. Today marked his transition from onboarding to full staff, and headed for the elevator that would take him to the 12th floor. Innovation, they called it. Elijah knew better. It was a political battlefield disguised as a think tank, and within days of starting, he'd sensed the territory lines. Cubicles weren't just desks, they were front lines. He had been placed near the hallway printer, a spot most avoided due to the mechanical groan that accompanied every page. That spot, too, said something. Not hostile, not welcoming, just invisible. And invisibility, in a place like this, was the first tactic of erasure. 3 weeks in, Elijah had already learned the unwritten rules. Speak softly. Don't interrupt. Never question Colton Drake in public. Colton, the project lead with a flawless resume and a smile honed by privilege, had a habit of silencing dissent with charm. That morning's meeting began as usual. Colton at the head of the glass-walled conference room, whiteboard markers in hand, tossing jargon like candy. When he opened the floor to ideas, Elijah leaned forward, calmly introduced a proposal for streamlining the onboarding funnel with a predictive behavior model. He had done the math, run the trials, modeled the output. It would work. He made it 7 words in before Colton cut him off. We'll table that and circle back. Without pause, Colton pivoted to Sasha on his left and asked her thoughts on a completely unrelated feature set. Elijah blinked once, said nothing, looked around the room. No one made eye contact. No one flinched. It was as if his voice had never existed. After the meeting, an internal summary circulated. A bulleted list of initiatives, including a watered-down version of Elijah's proposal. No attribution, no mention. The credit was framed as a group brainstorming win, the wording just vague enough to erase his fingerprint entirely. Elijah didn't react, not outwardly, but that night he began keeping notes. In a password-protected folder titled Timeline, he listed the date, the meeting, the interruption, and the summary omission. A pattern needed evidence, and Elijah had learned a long time ago not to rely on memory alone when fighting ghosts. By Friday, it happened again. In a Slack thread regarding user segmentation, Elijah made a detailed post breaking down a flaw in the current model. No one responded. 2 hours later, Colton reposted the same content with lighter language and a screenshot. Reactions flowed in. Applause emojis. Praise. Leadership chimed in. Nice find, Colton. Elijah sat still, took another note. That afternoon, as people filtered into the break room for catered sushi, Elijah entered late. Not because he wanted to, because his invite had arrived 10 minutes after everyone else's. Must have been a filter issue, someone said. He poured his tea, scanned the room. Every team lead huddled at the long table. Colton at the center, recounting a networking trip. Jokes, eye rolls, The kind of casual bonding Elijah had seen build careers faster than skill ever could. No one waved him over, so he took his bento and walked back to his desk. The next Monday, another update arrived in his inbox. This time, a shared deck on the upcoming product sprint. One slide mirrored his work exactly. Layout, language, even color scheme. But the speaker notes attributed the framework to Colton's assistant, Mark. Elijah reread it twice. Mark hadn't even been in the room during that whiteboard session. Again, no reaction. Just another log in the timeline. The small acts stacked quietly. No raised voices. No open insults. Just erasure by 1,000 smiles. When Elijah raised a point in a product sync, Colton nodded politely, then rephrased it as his own. During a hallway chat about backend scalability, Colton introduced Elijah to a visiting VP as someone who'd been helping with admin tasks. Discussions, file sharing, side chats before major launches, it was the bloodstream of the team. Elijah had access to the public spaces, of course, but one morning, he noticed something odd. During a call where sprint logistics were discussed, Colton mentioned a group vote on which product direction to pursue. Elijah blinked. He hadn't seen any vote. No poll. No file. No discussion. Quietly, he scrolled back through the general project channel. Nothing. Later that day, during a stand-up, someone casually referenced feedback shared in CoreSync Alpha, a group Elijah had never heard of. After the call, Elijah opened Slack and searched. The channel existed, but it was private, locked, not visible to him. He sent Colton a short message asking about it. A few minutes later, Colton replied, friendly on the surface, saying it must have been an oversight. He would get that sorted. 10 minutes later, Elijah was added, but to a different channel, similar in name, empty of content, clearly a placeholder. He typed again, clarifying, but received no further response that day. The next morning, Colton casually dropped a new dashboard into the company drive, a draft analysis tool meant to optimize retention through user segmentation. Elijah stared at it. It was nearly identical to the one he had proposed in a planning memo 2 days prior. Every detail, the variable categories, the proposed tagging logic, the use of machine learning lightweights for user prediction, was lifted directly from his work. But now it was presented by Colton as a concept in early exploration by Mark, his assistant. Elijah scanned the presentation metadata, created by Colton. Last modified 15 minutes ago. Mark's name appeared only in the title slide. Elijah sat back in his chair. That made two original ideas lifted, 2 erasures, 2 promotions of others in place of him. He added a new entry in his timeline document. Timestamp, detail, evidence link, but he said nothing to anyone. Instead, he sent himself an email from his work account to his personal inbox with the presentation he'd drafted earlier that week, complete with timestamps and revision history. He archived it silently. Insurance. That afternoon, during a UX workshop Colton led, Elijah joined the Zoom early. Mark and Sasha were already on. They laughed about something off camera, then quieted when he entered. The meeting proceeded smoothly, but Elijah noticed that while he was technically present, he was functionally ignored. When questions were posed to the team, they skipped over him. When ideas were discussed, they were phrased as if only Sasha and Mark had contributed. Once, Elijah unmuted and offered a suggestion about streamlining onboarding screens using dynamic defaults based on previous click behavior. No one responded. Colton didn't acknowledge it. 30 seconds of silence. Then the topic moved forward. Later that day, Mark posted the same idea in chat. Colton replied instantly. Now that's clever. Elijah saved the message. Screenshot. Timestamp. Another entry. It wasn't anger that settled in Elijah's chest. It was precision, focus, a cold clarity that this game wasn't going to end by waiting for someone to notice. That week, he kept his routine normal, polite in meetings, responsive in threads, but always watching. At one point, Colton posted a team update praising the group for collaborative brilliance on a new analytics suite. It was a suite Elijah had built piece by piece, using a sandbox model he had shared weeks prior during onboarding. The only difference now was the CSS wrapper had changed and the logos had been swapped. The code blocks were identical. Elijah copied the build into a save file, compared version numbers, made notes. Then something subtle happened that cemented the pattern. On Thursday, Colton held a feedback circle, an informal but influential practice at Sterling. It was unscheduled, spontaneous, and highly performative. Elijah was excluded from the invite. Sasha casually mentioned it to someone in passing while walking past his desk. Elijah opened his calendar. Nothing. No meeting. No thread. No notice. Colton had formed a selective circle of influence, one Elijah was not meant to be part of. The next day, during a product milestone briefing, Elijah was asked by an external vendor about his role on the team. Before he could answer, Colton cut in. Elijah's great. He helps fill in on a bunch of support tasks. Solid documentation guy. Elijah remained still. Documenting? He had built the framework they were using. But this wasn't about truth. It was about narrative. By Monday, Elijah noticed he was no longer CC'd in major threads. His document access changed slightly. Project folders he previously could edit now appeared as view only. He tested it, uploaded a draft. It was deleted within minutes. A private message from Colton followed. Elijah scanned his inbox 3 times that morning. No invite, no calendar placeholder, no explanation. He checked the internal portal. His name wasn't listed. He waited until mid-morning before sending a brief message to HR. A polite inquiry, nothing accusatory. Just a professional request for clarification. The response came an hour later. Thank you for reaching out, Elijah. Unfortunately, due to limited capacity, the current cohort has already been finalized. We encourage you to apply again next quarter. Best, Lydia Talent Programs. Elijah sat still, staring at the words. He hadn't been given the chance to apply. The selection process was internal and discretionary, based on manager recommendations. Colton had never mentioned it. Elijah's jaw tightened as he minimized the message. He stood up, walked to the break room, poured himself a coffee, and returned to his desk without saying a word. That afternoon, he walked past the main conference room and glimpsed the setup. Rows of chairs arranged in a U-shape, crisp nameplates on the table, folders with embossed workshop logos, and a tray of pastries untouched in the corner. Through the glass walls, he saw Mark laughing with the VP of Operations. Sasha was already mid-presentation, pointing at a whiteboard with a confident smile. Elijah took a photo of the room, not out of spite, but for the record. Back at his desk, he logged the entry. Date, event, HR response, internal witness names, evidence photo, not invited despite performance indicators, not even given notice. This was not an oversight. It was a filtration system. Later that week, the company held a networking mixer in the rooftop lounge, a biannual affair complete with champagne, catered hors d'oeuvres, and the kind of unstructured conversations that turned into promotions. Elijah arrived precisely on time, wearing a charcoal blazer, tailored trousers, and his quiet confidence. He greeted the host, scanned his name into the check-in tablet, and stepped into the elevator. On the rooftop, the space shimmered with hanging lights and panoramic views of the city skyline. Music floated above soft conversations. Elijah moved with purpose, but as he crossed the room toward the main seating area, a server intercepted him. The man was polite, nervous, and apologetic. I'm sorry, sir, but this area is currently reserved for senior division members and high-tier invitees. Elijah raised an eyebrow. He had seen no such distinction in the invite. May I ask who marked this restriction? He asked evenly. The server hesitated. That would be Mr. Drake, sir, said to direct all operations team members to the side patio. Elijah didn't argue. He nodded, turned toward the indicated area, and walked to the edge of the rooftop, where a few others were gathered, support staff, admin assistants, back-end techs. It wasn't a bad space. The view was the same, but the conversations were different. No executives wandered over. No senior leadership made rounds. Elijah stood by the railing, sipping sparkling water, and watched Colton hold court in the center of the VIP cluster. They toasted over flutes, laughed too loudly, made introductions for interns with the right last names. Elijah wasn't angry. Not anymore. He had moved past offense. This was confirmation. He listened, he documented. And when the evening ended, he walked calmly down to the ground floor, opened his notebook at home, and wrote down everything. The time he arrived, the name of the server, the language used, the difference in access. He matched it to his performance evaluations, above average for 2 quarters straight, commended by clients, quietly solving problems others overlooked. The data did not lie. The system did. The pattern was simple. Exclude in ways that couldn't be easily quoted. Restrict access by redefining relevance. Marginalize by omission, not confrontation. Elijah began to treat his workplace as a map, with zones marked for visibility and zones marked for shadows. He tracked who was allowed into which space, who got feedback loops, who had platform opportunities, and who, like him, was told to wait quietly in the wings. It wasn't just Colton. That was clear now. It was a web of complicit silence. People who saw but chose not to act. People who benefited from the boundary lines drawn around others. And above all, a leadership culture that rewarded polish over principle. One morning, Elijah noticed his desk had been moved. Not formally, not with boxes and announcements. Just a quiet relocation. His nameplate was now positioned 1 quadrant over, by the IT storage closet. His request for clarification went unanswered. When he returned from lunch, the cleaning crew had replaced his chair with one from a break room, slightly lower, uneven wheels. Another note in the timeline. The next team-wide email congratulated Sasha on a breakthrough idea, a simplified dashboard interface that, to Elijah, looked awfully familiar. He opened his own files. 2 months prior, he had prototyped a similar design. Colton had given brief feedback, then told him not to circulate it yet. Now it was live, credited to Sasha. No trace of his contribution. He didn't confront her, didn't message Colton, just saved the draft, backed up the code to an external drive, and added it to his collection. As the quarter drew to a close, Elijah began to attend fewer meetings. Not out of disengagement, out of clarity. He spent his time differently now, building a complete picture of what was being taken from him, 1 pixel at a time. He noted how his calendar filled only with task-based work. No strategic invites. No review panels. No visibility tracks. His name didn't show up on the promotional review matrix, though he'd submitted the required materials. He had spent 2 weeks building a customized demo environment tailored to the client's data preferences, refining the UX simulation to near perfection. The demo was not only functional but elegant, reflecting a level of precision that would speak to both the business and engineering minds in the room. He had been told by Colton himself to prepare to speak during the demonstration block, introducing the system flow and data logic. Elijah had rehearsed his segment with calm confidence, knowing this pitch could determine the firm's positioning for years. But as the team assembled backstage in the conference center ballroom, just moments before the doors opened, Colton pulled Elijah aside. His tone was casual, his posture relaxed, but his words sharp. "There's been a change," he said. "We decided to simplify the flow. You'll still be on standby, but we won't have you present live. We just want a more streamlined, polished visual. You understand, right?" Elijah blinked once. His hand still rested on the presentation remote. He had been told for weeks that he would lead the walkthrough. Now, he was told to sit back. He asked if something had changed in the plan or if there were concerns. Colton smiled, placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Not at all, just optics. The client's expecting a certain level of alignment. Nothing personal. We just want a cohesive image." Elijah didn't need explained. He had seen the seating chart. For speakers, all white, all styled in identical fashion, all with curated, LinkedIn-ready smiles. He stepped back, nodded once, and returned to the equipment station without another word. As the meeting began and the lights dimmed, Elijah stood behind the curtain, adjusting the AV feed, running the background data switch, and watching as someone else narrated his work. They skipped details, fumbled a line, brushed over nuance. The clients didn't notice, but Elijah did. Afterward, Colton patted him on the back, saying, "Great support today. Wouldn't have run as smooth without you." Elijah smiled with tight restraint. That night, he stayed late and exported a copy of the final deck with metadata intact. Then he logged another entry, removed from speaking role minutes before meeting. Reason cited, optics. Supporting material originated by EM. Days later, the quarterly evaluation cycle arrived. Each employee was reviewed by a combination of peer feedback, managerial notes, and self-assessment. Elijah had submitted his materials on time, detailing his cross-team contributions, issue resolution analytics, and prototype efficiency gains. He expected a fair review. What he received was a blow. In the official summary, Colton had written that Elijah demonstrated solid technical ability but lacked collaborative engagement and had not shown initiative in leadership settings. Elijah sat still in his chair as he read the document. The phrasing was diplomatic, but the message was unmistakable. He was being framed as a quiet contributor, not a leader, not promotable, not representative. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had been blocked from visibility, then penalized for being unseen, sidelined from presenting, then critiqued for not stepping up, excluded from channels, then noted for not initiating team bonding. He had the receipts, the messages, the videos, the timeline. He considered appealing the review, but then closed the portal. Not yet. Let them believe it was working. Let them think he was shrinking. The following week, he was assigned to a minor bug fix team. Work that had once been given to interns now landed on his plate. Simple interface errors, UI color mismatches, graph rendering issues. He was told it was temporary, just helping balance sprint load. But he knew better. He watched as newer hires were placed into product ownership roles. Watched as Sasha was tapped to co-lead a cross-functional task force. Watched as Colton publicly praised Mark for a new initiative that Elijah had designed 6 weeks earlier in a buried Confluence note. One afternoon, while grabbing coffee in the lounge, Elijah overheard two coworkers discussing team reshuffling. One of them mentioned that Colton had told leadership Elijah was great with grunt work, but lacked polish. That he was better off in a backseat role. Elijah smiled slightly and walked away before they saw him. Later, he submitted an internal request to export his employee record. Company policy allowed full access to historical data, project logs, code check-ins, task history. He flagged inconsistencies, downloaded work attribution metrics, and archived everything to encrypted storage. He even recorded a few team meetings, not to expose words, but tone. The subtle pauses, the shifts in energy when he spoke, the unspoken consensus that he was an auxiliary part of the team. The improvement rippled through 2 departments and directly impacted customer retention metrics. So when it came time to prepare the quarterly performance snapshot for his division, Elijah compiled a clean, data-driven report with cross-functional validations. He ran simulations twice to ensure integrity. He triple-checked the math. The final result was clear. His team had exceeded the KPI target by 19%, the best number Sterling and Company had seen all year in the product innovation track. He submitted the report through the shared portal and flagged it for review. 2 hours later, Colton called him into a side meeting. His tone was light but measured. He opened the report on screen and leaned back in his chair. "This looks good, Elijah, but we don't want to create unrealistic benchmarks." Elijah blinked once, unsure what he meant. Colton continued with a half smile, saying, "These numbers are technically accurate, but they set a tone. You don't want to make the other teams look bad, do you? It's not a competition. Let's temper the language, round down where it's close, and say performance was steady. That's easier for execs to digest." Elijah said nothing for several seconds. Then, calmly, he replied that he didn't believe in modifying factual data to suit political optics. Colton's smile didn't fade, but it cooled. He leaned forward and said, "Well, I'm your lead, and I'm asking you to make the adjustment." Elijah complied, but not before exporting the original version and saving both files side by side in his encrypted archive. He also logged the Slack conversation that followed, where Colton shared the final numbers with senior leadership and praised the team's consistency. Elijah added another note to his timeline: excellence flattened for convenience. Manipulation masked as diplomacy. 1 week later, Elijah received confirmation he had been accepted to present at the annual Internal Innovation Summit. He had applied independently, submitting a proposal to speak about modular scalability in back-end systems, an area he had piloted with great success. The review committee had approved it. His name was printed in the event brochure. He began preparing the session, building slides, reviewing data, tightening his narrative. For the first time in months, he felt the stirrings of visibility again. It didn't last. The day before the event, he received a calendar cancellation. No explanation, just a removal notice. Confused, he opened the updated agenda. His time slot had been reassigned to a new hire, a recent graduate from a referral program Colton personally sponsored. The topic was vaguely similar but less technical. Elijah reached out to the event coordinator, who replied that Colton had restructured the lineup to better reflect the department's current priorities. No further information was provided. Elijah closed the email without response. He opened his files, saved the deck, archived the correspondence, then sat in silence. That afternoon, during a department meeting, Colton commended the upcoming presenters and highlighted how important it was to show balanced, forward-facing narratives that aligned with corporate identity. His glance never touched Elijah, but the intent was clear. Not technical excellence, not truth, just optics. Elijah listened, nodded, and said nothing. He had begun to understand the deeper mechanism at play. This wasn't just exclusion, it was suppression. Any momentum he built was quietly dismantled. Any visibility he earned was rerouted or erased. And worse, behind the scenes, the whispers had started. One evening, Elijah caught wind of a Slack thread between senior team members discussing peer reviews. One comment stood out, typed by someone in operations and upvoted by Mark. "Smart guy, but doesn't really fit our rhythm. Bit too intense." Another comment appeared beneath. "Yeah, very focused, but hard to connect with. Doesn't bring much energy into a room." The comments were coded, but familiar. Elijah recognized the subtext. Too focused meant not sociable. Hard to connect meant not part of the inner circle. Not bringing energy meant not playing along. They were writing a narrative in his absence. Not that he was incompetent. Worse, that he was a misfit. A quiet liability. The next day, Colton gave a team address about transparency and shared values. He praised collaboration, openness, and being a team player. He said they were looking to invest in people who reflected those traits consistently. Elijah stood at the back of a room, arms crossed, as Colton scanned the crowd like a conductor receiving applause. Afterward, a junior developer mentioned hearing Colton say Elijah was brilliant but high maintenance. That phrase echoed in Elijah's mind all night, not because it was painful, but because it was so calculated. They weren't trying to break him. They were trying to reduce him. Where before Colton's control had been subtle, now it carried the theatricality of dominance. The next incident began with a formal client summit, a high-profile meeting involving stakeholders from a global tech conglomerate. The room was polished to sterile perfection, a glass-walled conference suite on the executive floor with panoramic views of the skyline, and a dozen name placards neatly arranged around a wide table. Elijah had arrived early, wearing a tailored navy suit and carrying a set of revised proposal drafts personally requested by a partner on the client side. He had helped draft the integration architecture and knew the dependencies better than anyone on the team. When Colton entered with his signature confidence, he smiled and nodded to the client reps, shaking hands, cracking jokes, and settling into his seat at the head of the table. As the meeting began, he stood and introduced the Sterling and Company team one by one, naming roles and specialties with fluid charm. Sasha, lead on UX design. Mark, responsible for client outreach. Jenna, systems liaison. He gestured to each with a smile, pausing for nods and waves. Elijah sat at the front corner of the table, directly to Colton's left. But when the introductions reached his seat, Colton simply moved on, skipping the spot as if it were empty. There was no glance, no acknowledgement, not even a hesitation. The clients didn't question it. Why would they? Elijah remained silent, his expression unreadable. He opened his folder and began taking notes, documenting every minute of the meeting. Throughout the discussion, Colton occasionally referenced back-end refinements, lifting phrases directly from Elijah's past memos without attribution. At one point, a client complimented the data flow logic, asking who designed that segment. Colton answered, "That came from our collaborative infrastructure group, tight team effort." Elijah didn't flinch. He added a timestamp to his notes. That afternoon, back in the lower-level cafeteria, Colton stood with a group of junior staff near the espresso station. His voice, as always, carried just far enough to be overheard. He was recounting a story, laughing between sips of black coffee. "You know, someone once told me they wanted to run this company," he said, grinning. "Imagine that. Just walked in one day and believed the chair upstairs was waiting for them. Wild, right?" The group chuckled obligingly. One in turn asked who he meant. Colton didn't answer. Instead, he turned his head slightly, looked directly at Elijah sitting alone by the window, and raised his eyebrows as if to say, "You know who?" The laughter grew louder. Elijah didn't react. He calmly stabbed a piece of chicken from his lunch tray and chewed thoughtfully. But inside, he marked the moment. This wasn't coded anymore. This was performance. Colton was publicly mocking him, reducing his ambition to a punchline. And no one stopped it. Not the bystanders, not the leaders, not the colleagues who had once shaken his hand and said they respected his work. Elijah understood now that the culture had evolved past exclusion. It had normalized spectacle. Later that week, at an internal Friday briefing, Colton opened with a recap of recent project milestones. As he clicked through the slides, he added improvised commentary, saying how teamwork had kept things running and how some people know how to stay in their lane and shine quietly. Again, he paused with that same glance, casual to everyone else, direct to Elijah. A few people chuckled. Elijah said nothing. When the meeting ended, one of the newer hires approached him by the elevator and whispered, "Hey, I thought that back-end deployment was yours." Elijah nodded slowly, then replied, "It was." The next day, an email was circulated to all staff with links to an upcoming company podcast featuring employee spotlights. Colton had curated the guest list. Elijah's name, once submitted in early rounds, had been removed. Instead, a peer who had only been at the company for 5 months was featured as a rising systems innovator, using language copy-pasted from a white paper Elijah had written but never published. The podcast dropped over the weekend. Elijah listened to it while sipping tea on his balcony. The speaker stumbled through jargon he clearly didn't understand. Colton's voice in the intro was warm, polished, full of admiration. Elijah forwarded the link to his personal archive and closed the tab. On Monday morning, someone in HR accidentally copied him on a reply-all thread between Colton and a VP regarding a lateral promotion plan. In the message, Colton referred to Elijah as valuable on the ground, but not executive material. He added that while Elijah was a solid task player, he lacked brand alignment. Elijah read the email 3 times. Brand alignment, a phrase that sounded corporate but meant something else entirely. He replied with a polite note asking if the email had been intended for him. He received no response. That evening, he opened his master file and typed a single sentence. "They are preparing the coffin before I've even stopped breathing." Elijah had built his career on logic, structure, and composure. He wasn't reactive. He was strategic. He didn't fire back. He built foundations. But something beneath the surface was no longer waiting. It was watching. That Monday, the internal alert system triggered an unscheduled calendar block labeled Company-Wide Strategic Briefing, executive tier only. The invite was marked mandatory for all mid-level managers, team leads, and above. The location was the Skyview Auditorium on the 41st floor, a space typically reserved for investor relations or all-hands quarterly reviews. Whispers began almost immediately. People speculated it was about a merger. Others suggested restructuring. But deep down, everyone knew what it meant. The CEO, Alan Keene, had been in his position for over 20 years. Rumors of his retirement had circulated quietly for months. Everyone expected a succession announcement. Everyone assumed the heir would be one of the executive VPs. Colton, among others, had been posturing for that opportunity since before Elijah was hired. On the day of the briefing, Elijah arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in the same unassuming style he always wore, sharp, reserved, unbranded. He took his seat near the back of the room, unnoticed as usual. No one saved him a seat. No one nodded. The presentation began with Alan himself stepping to the podium, his voice steady, his tone composed. He spoke about legacy, about growth, about the future. Then came the words they'd all been waiting for. Next week, at the 10-year company celebration, I'll formally introduce my successor. The next CEO of Sterling & Company has already been selected by the board of directors. The room tensed. Eyebrows raised. Smiles froze. Alan continued, but he gave no name, just a promise, a public reveal, a moment they'd never forget. Elijah listened without movement. The corners of his mouth barely shifted. He remained in his seat until the room emptied, then returned to his desk and resumed work. That evening, as he shut down his company laptop, a single email arrived in his personal inbox. It came from a secure channel, marked confidential, sent by the chairman of the board. The subject line was simple: confirmation of executive appointment. The body was shorter than expected. Formal congratulations. Legal language. On behalf of the board, we welcome your leadership. Attached was a sealed document, his official appointment as incoming Chief Executive Officer of Sterling & Company, to be announced the following Friday. Elijah stared at the screen for a long time, not because he was surprised, but because he wasn't. He had known for weeks. A back-channel conversation with the former CFO, a discreet dinner in the city with 2 board members, a mutual contact who had asked what his vision would be if, hypothetically, he were to take the reins. Elijah had not chased this seat. It had come to him, not by chance, but by alignment, by strategy. The board had seen what others didn't. They had reviewed project logs, stakeholder feedback, profit impact ratios. While Colton curated social charisma, Elijah delivered results that moved markets. He had led from the shadows. Now, the spotlight was his to step into. But he did not forward the email. He did not call family. He did not tell a soul. Not yet. Because part of him wanted to see how far they would go, what else they would try, what final acts of dismissal they had planned, not knowing they were orchestrating their own unraveling. The next few days unfolded like theater. Colton strutted through the halls with renewed arrogance, making offhand remarks about new blood and fresh faces. In a lunch meeting with his inner circle, he speculated about who would be CEO. "It'll be someone we all know," he said with certainty. "Someone with vision. Someone who fits the brand." Elijah passed behind them unnoticed, carrying his tray. In another conversation near the design pods, Sasha suggested that maybe the board would go with an outsider. "Someone who could reset the culture," she said. Colton laughed. "Please. They don't want revolution. They want familiarity." That evening, Elijah received another email from the board, this time asking if he would be comfortable preparing a short speech for the ceremony. They emphasized discretion. No leaks. No acknowledgments until the official moment. He replied with a simple confirmation. Yes, he would be ready. At his apartment that night, Elijah sat by the window, city lights glowing below. He opened his laptop, accessed the timeline file he had been building for months, and duplicated it into a new format. Dozens of crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, while waitstaff in white gloves passed flutes of champagne and hors d'oeuvres sculpted into shapes that no one could name. Music floated in, soft but commanding, and the company's most powerful faces gathered beneath banners that read "A Decade of Innovation." Elijah Monroe arrived exactly 32 minutes early. He was not escorted, not announced. He walked alone through the back entrance designated for speakers and executive staff. His suit was black, perfectly tailored, minimalist. His posture straight. Around his neck, he wore a discreet but unmistakable badge. Executive Access CEO Designate. No one stopped him. No one questioned his place. But that was only the beginning. Across the ballroom, Colton was already working the room. He had never looked more comfortable, shaking hands, laughing too loudly, pausing for photos, dropping hints to anyone who'd listen. "Big things coming," he said. "Transitions ahead. Just wait." Sasha stood nearby, sipping from a flute and echoing his confidence. Everyone assumed Colton knew something they didn't. Everyone was wrong. As guests filled the room, the main stage was lit in soft blue. A massive digital screen stretched across its back wall, dark for now. Elijah stood behind the curtain, out of view, watching as familiar faces took their seats. He saw them all. The ones who had ignored him. The ones who had stolen credit. The ones who had laughed. None of them knew what was coming. The MC took the stage. Her voice rang out across the ballroom, welcoming the audience, thanking the founding team, nodding to the milestones. She invited everyone to raise a toast. Then she paused and smiled, signaling toward the technician near the audio desk. The lights dimmed. The screen came alive. A cinematic montage began to play, gliding camera shots of Sterling and Company's early days, black and white photos of its first office, flash cuts of product launches and expansion maps. Then the footage shifted. Newer clips appeared. Strategic meetings. Corporate retreats. Moments of decision-making. In one frame, Elijah stood presenting in front of a whiteboard, pointing to diagrams with steady confidence. In another, he walked beside board members in Brussels. Then him again, shaking hands with foreign investors. Then again, briefing a division overseas, speaking into a microphone with calm command. No narration, just music and text. Innovation needs vision. Vision needs courage. Courage needs leadership. Then, a final image. Elijah, standing alone at the top of the Sterling and Company headquarters, overlooking the skyline. The screen faded to black. Then a single line appeared, introducing the next Chief Executive Officer of Sterling and Company, Elijah Monroe. The silence that followed was not quiet. It was electric. Audible gasps echoed through the room. Some applauded reflexively. Others froze. Several mouths opened but made no sound. Then, one by one, the audience rose to their feet. A standing ovation rippled across the room, hesitant at first, then thunderous. Elijah stepped out from behind the curtain. His expression was calm, his posture unwavering. He walked across the stage without hurry, every step deliberate. When he reached the podium, the applause was still growing. Even the board, seated at the front table, stood and clapped. Alan Keene joined them. Colton did not. He was seated dead center, a half-smile frozen on his face, his eyes wide, body stiff. Elijah met his gaze for a single second before turning to the microphone. The room quieted. Elijah began his speech with precision. He spoke of legacy, of truth, of the unseen labor that had built the pillars now being celebrated. He thanked the board for their trust. He acknowledged the company's past while outlining a future of transparency, merit, and justice. He did not call names. He did not air grievances. But every word he spoke carried a resonance that struck deep in the hearts of those who had tried to silence him. They knew, and that was enough. When he finished, the applause returned. Not from duty, but from revelation. Some clapped with respect. Others clapped from shame. But everyone clapped. After he stepped down, Elijah did not linger. He made his way through the crowd, receiving nods, shaken hands, hushed congratulations. Colton remained seated. Sasha had vanished. One of the board members approached Elijah near the side exit, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've earned this," the man said, "and we're ready to follow." Elijah nodded. Elijah returned to the executive floor not with fanfare, but with purpose. His office door bore his name in simple silver type, understated and deliberate. The morning after the celebration, he arrived before most, walked into the glass-paneled conference room that once only held him as a guest, and opened a private session with the Internal Audit Division. The directive was clear. He instructed a full review of all employee evaluations, lateral transfers, promotions, disciplinary actions, and resignation records over the past 24 months. The parameters focused not only on procedural compliance, but on cultural indicators, language used in reviews, frequency of advancement among underrepresented groups, patterns of assignment to high-visibility projects. He requested anonymized versions first. Then he asked for the raw names. There was no outrage, no raised voices, only silence, nods, and the sound of keys typing. Later that day, Elijah sent a second order. An external ethics review board would be brought in to oversee the investigation, not from within HR, not from internal legal, from an independent body specializing in workplace bias, systemic marginalization, and leadership conduct. This announcement was made in the company-wide newsletter, buried beneath Q2 targets and client wins. But it did not go unnoticed. By Wednesday, Colton Drake's calendar was wiped. His access credentials were revoked. His name disappeared from project threads. Officially, he was placed on leave pending review of conduct and administrative overreach. Unofficially, everyone knew what it meant. The reaction rippled quietly. Some whispered disbelief. Others expressed hollow concern. But many stayed silent, eyes down, unsure whether to protect or distance themselves. The day after Colton's removal, Elijah held a private meeting with the entire Product Innovation Division. He spoke clearly and without venom. He acknowledged past failures in leadership, the toxic culture of favoritism, and the invisible thresholds that had defined success for too long. He did not accuse. He did not single out. He simply said the system had failed its best people, and that failure would not continue. Mandatory participation in a comprehensive professional conduct training program was announced. Not optional, not symbolic. Every team member, from intern to director, would undergo evaluation and education in bias identification, ethical leadership, and equitable team dynamics. An outside firm would lead the process. Feedback would be documented and anonymized only until patterns emerged. Several employees reached out to HR that day, requesting clarification on whether prior behavior could be reported retroactively. HR answered yes. From his office, Elijah read the reports as they came in. None of them surprised him. He saw the names, the remarks, the way certain employees were described as unpolished, hard to manage, not aligned. He saw the patterns. He saw how people who looked like him had been looped into back-end tracks without exit ramps, while others had been elevated before they'd even proven themselves. And he saw Colton's fingerprints on all of it. Elijah issued a quiet memo to legal. The memo requested that Colton's conduct and all supporting documentation be forwarded to the company's ethics committee for formal review. The tone of the memo was clinical, the content devastating. Alongside it, Elijah submitted his own report. Not an accusation, but a testimony. A curated timeline that documented 3 years of silence, erasure, mockery, and sabotage. Each page cited messages, meeting records, performance metrics, and altered evaluations. It was not a revenge document. It was a record of what had been allowed to thrive under the guise of leadership. The committee opened proceedings within 48 hours. In the meantime, Elijah continued leading without spectacle. He visited departments personally, not with speeches, but with questions. He asked what tools they lacked, what support they never received, who had gone unnoticed, who had been overlooked. For the first time in years, teams started submitting names of people for consideration, people previously called too quiet, too rigid, too niche. Elijah reviewed every name personally. In a quiet move no one expected, he recommended 3 mid-level engineers for new leadership roles. One of them was a woman who had nearly resigned the previous quarter after being passed over for a less qualified hire. When she received the promotion letter, she cried in the elevator. Elijah watched from his office window. He said nothing, just turned back to his notes. 2 days later, news broke internally that Colton's file had been escalated to corporate risk. Pending review, he would not be returning to his role. Colton did not issue a statement. He did not appeal. Those closest to him began scrubbing old photos, avoiding public alignment. Some deleted past Slack jokes. Some claimed they'd never supported him. Elijah ignored them all, because the point was never to punish a man. Weeks after the investigation concluded and the storm of internal restructuring began to settle, Sterling and Company felt like a company exhaling after years of holding its breath. The silence that had once cloaked injustice was now filled with new voices, new policies, and a new awareness that could not be unseen. But while systems were being rebuilt and initiatives were shifting from theory to practice, one unresolved chapter still lingered in the minds of many. Colton Drake's departure had been handled with professionalism but not finality. His suspension stood, his influence erased from current projects, but no official closure had yet come. That changed one overcast Thursday morning when a company-wide notice announced a live internal forum on leadership reflection and cultural reset. Attendance was encouraged. Cameras would be rolling. The notice came from Elijah's office directly, signed by him, but bearing no detail about who would speak. The forum was held in the same Skyview auditorium where the CEO succession had first been hinted. This time, no stage banners, no ambient music, just rows of seats, a podium, a screen, and silence. Employees arrived with quiet anticipation. They whispered theories, scanned the stage for clues, and traded cautious looks. Elijah sat in the front row, alone, composed, eyes fixed forward. Then, without announcement, Colton walked onto the stage. He wore no suit, no designer watch, no polished grin. Just a plain dress shirt, slacks, and a posture that no longer bent backward for applause. The murmurs started immediately, a wave of shifting energy, but Colton didn't look away. He stepped to the microphone and paused. Then he began to speak, not with performance, not with defense, with admission. He said he had failed, not in tasks or outcomes, but in character. He said he had allowed his insecurities to manifest as control, his privilege to masquerade as competence. He admitted he had believed his image mattered more than others' substance. And worse, he had convinced himself that leadership meant exclusion, that authority required silence from those beneath him. As he spoke, the room changed. Some stared in disbelief. Some looked down. Others, especially those who had once echoed his tone, grew still. He apologized to everyone he had ever overlooked, minimized, manipulated, or stolen from. He said he did not expect forgiveness, but he needed the company to hear the truth, not for his redemption, but for theirs. When he finished, he stepped away from the podium, nodded once to Elijah, and left the stage. The room was silent. Elijah stood and walked calmly up to the front. He addressed the room not with celebration or judgment, but with clarity. He reminded them that justice is not only about correction, it's about transformation. He said that leadership without humility is merely control, and progress without reflection is just reinvention of the same structure. Then he revealed the decision. Colton would not be returning to an executive role, but he would not be terminated either. Instead, he had accepted a new assignment, head of Sterling and Company's Community Equity Initiative, a program Elijah had launched to provide mentorship, job training, and reintegration opportunities to underserved populations. The program operated far from the spotlight. No suits, no power lunches, just work, service, repair. The reaction was mixed. Some called it generous. Others said it was undeserved. But Elijah knew what they didn't. He knew the power of confronting wrong not with vengeance, but with responsibility. And he knew that for someone like Colton, being removed from prestige and placed into humility was not mercy. It was the only real justice. Months passed. The company continued evolving. Internal metrics showed higher satisfaction. Retention among previously marginalized staff doubled, and leadership demographics began to shift. The culture became one of merit, not mimicry. One day, while visiting a community tech center funded by the New Equity Initiative, Elijah watched from afar as Colton stood by a whiteboard, explaining network logic to a group of young students. There was no camera, no press, just a man once arrogant, now patient, listening more than speaking. After the session, one of the kids asked him what he used to do. Colton paused before answering, then said, "I used to think I ran things. Now, I help others build their own." Back at headquarters, Elijah sat alone in his office, lights low, reviewing progress reports. He saw the numbers, yes, but more importantly, he saw the names. New names. Names that once had no seat. Now they led. As he closed a file and looked out over the city skyline, he thought not about revenge or reward, but about responsibility. He had been given power not to punish, but to prove that real leadership doesn't need to shout, dominate, or erase. It listens. It includes. It remembers. And it repairs. What they once tried to take from him, he had returned to others tenfold, not out of pride, but because he understood the cost of being made invisible. Sterling and Company was not perfect. It never would be. But under his leadership, it would never again pretend not to see. The end. If this story moved you, take a moment to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. What part of Elijah's journey hit you the hardest? Which moment made you stop and think? Let us know in the comments below and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts.